A quiet street. A door left unlocked. By nightfall, a home becomes a tableau of ritual and blood. The headlines say vampire. Detectives say predator. We'll show you how a man's delusion became Sacramento's nightmare.
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
On a winter evening in Sacramento, California, a routine visit turned into a discovery so grotesque that veteran officers struggled for words. In the days that followed, more victims, each scene marked by a chilling constant, an unlocked door, and a visitor who never should have crossed the threshold. Tonight, we retrace the path of a gaunt intruder whose private madness spilled into public terror. And we ask, who failed to intervene, and when could it have made a difference? We're telling that story right after this. In the late 1970s, Sacramento, California was stalked by a nightmare made flesh. A string of grisly murders marked by blood draining, cannibalism, and necrophilia gripped the community with terror. The perpetrator was Richard Trenton Chase, a 27-year-old schizophrenic whose delusions drove him to slaughter 6 victims in the span of a month. Dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento for his obsession with drinking blood, Chase's brief reign of terror ended just before Halloween, 1978, but the horror he unleashed was eternal. What follows is the nightmarish true story of Richard Chase, from the early warning signs of his madness to the lasting legacy of his crimes. Richard Chase did not become a monster overnight. The warning signs were visible from early on. Born May 23, 1950, he endured a troubled childhood with abusive disciplinarian parents. By the age of 10, Chase displayed the infamous McDonald triad of behaviors: persistent bedwetting, fascination with fire setting, and cruelty to animals, often considered red flags for future violence. Indeed, young Chase was known to torture and kill cats and other small animals, even drinking the blood of a bird at least once. Such acts, combined with a violent home environment, hinted at the fatal madness growing inside him. As a teenager in the 1960s, Chase descended into heavy drug use, LSD, marijuana, and alcohol, which only worsened his mental instability. He struggled socially and sexually. Chase was unable to maintain an erection with girlfriends, and a psychiatrist suggested his impotence stemmed from deep psychological issues as well as bottled anger. Increasingly erratic, Chase moved out at 18 years old and bounced between roommates who were all alarmed by his bizarre behavior. He would wander the apartment naked and remain constantly high until his roommates, terrified, fled rather than live with him. Chase's paranoia also intensified. He became convinced something was physically wrong with him. He believed his cranial bones were shifting under his scalp and even shaved his head in order to watch them move. He also suspected his mother was poisoning him, and after heated arguments, he left to live on his own in an apartment his father paid for. Chase's delusions soon took on a medical horror quality. In his early 20s, he developed extreme hypochondria, complaining that his heart had stopped beating or that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery, and holding oranges to his head in the belief that vitamin C could be absorbed directly to his brain. He fixated on his blood and organs. Chase was convinced he wasn't producing enough blood and that his heart was shrinking. Desperate and delusional, he began killing and eating animals in a twisted attempt at a sort of self-medication. Living alone, Chase would capture rabbits, cats, even dogs, gutting them and blending their entrails with Coca-Cola to drink. He truly believed that by ingesting these creatures, he could prevent his heart from shrinking further and stop his blood from turning to powder. Neighbors began to notice the steady disappearance of local pets entering his apartment, never to be seen again. The mental health system repeatedly failed to contain Richard Chase's downward spiral. In 1973, at age 23, he sought help at a psychiatric hospital, begging for treatment as he felt his blood had stopped flowing and he was suffering from cardiac arrest. Doctors observed a tense, nervous, wild-eyed young man who was filthy and disheveled and diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. Yet, after only a brief 72-hour observation, Chase's mother angrily demanded her son be released, and hospital staff discharged him against all medical advice. For a time, medication improved his condition, but his mother soon weaned him off of the antipsychotics due to their side effects. Without medication, Chase's psychosis deepened. In 1975, he injected himself with rabbit's blood in a bizarre experiment and nearly died from blood poisoning. This incident led to his involuntary commitment at Beverly Manor, a psychiatric hospital where doctors documented his severe illness. Staff there nicknamed him Dracula after finding him with blood smeared around his mouth. Chase had been biting the heads off of birds and drinking their blood through the institution's window bars. He even managed to steal syringes in order to draw blood from therapy dogs for later consumption. Despite these extreme behaviors, bureaucratic decisions put Chase back on the street. After a year of treatment with psychotropic drugs, in 1976, officials deemed him no longer a danger and released him into his mother's custody. Hospital staff strongly protested, insisting that Chase was still gravely ill and dangerous. But their warnings went unheeded. Almost immediately, his mother stopped his medication and allowed him to live alone again. Chase's psychosis and blood fixation roared back with a vengeance. He continued torturing and killing animals, purchasing puppies only to strangle or mutilate them for blood and raw organs. On one occasion, Chase's mother walked in on him, tearing open the belly of a dead cat and smearing its blood over his face and body. A ghastly scene, yet she never reported this incident to authorities. Over the summer of 1977, Chase's behavior grew more unhinged and brazen. In August of that year, police in rural Nevada found him naked, covered in blood, and carrying a bucket with a bloody liver inside. He had driven to the area, and witnesses said he had a puppy with him earlier. The dog was never found. Chase told the officers a far-fetched tale. He claimed the blood was his own, leaking out of him, and he had no idea what happened to the animal. The blood turned out to be from a cow, and with no evidence of a crime, authorities inexplicably let Chase go. It was yet another missed opportunity to stop the unfolding tragedy. Chase returned to Sacramento, arms and mind full of bloodlust, ready to make the escalation from animals to humans. In the span of a single month, from late December 1977 through January 1978, Richard Chase unleashed a series of murders so gruesome that they defy belief. His first known victim was 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, an engineer and father of two. On the evening of December 29, 1977, Griffin was shot in the chest and killed in a random drive-by shooting as he helped his wife carry groceries into their East Sacramento home. The murder was shockingly motiveless, a stranger killing that baffled detectives at first. Griffin's wife initially thought he had had a heart attack, and only later realized a bullet had struck him. 2 days before this shooting, a nearby resident had reported a mysterious gunshot through her window, and police found a spent .22 shell casing at her home. Likely a practice shot by Chase in the same neighborhood. But at the time, there was little to connect these incidents. Neighbors gave vague descriptions of a young man fleeing, and leads grew cold. The community was left rattled by the seemingly random killing of a Good Samaritan on his own driveway. Chase's pattern of predation soon became apparent. He cruised residential areas, testing front doors at random. If a door was locked, he took it as a sign he was not welcome and moved on. But if a door was unlocked, that, in his twisted logic, was an invitation to enter. In the weeks after Ambrose Griffin's murder, Chase had a series of near misses that could have been additional tragedies. On one occasion, in early January 1978, a young woman came home to find a gaunt, wild-eyed man inside her house. He had entered through her unlocked door, urinated on her infant's bed, and defecated in a drawer, then fled when discovered. It was later confirmed this prowler was Chase, indulging in disturbing acts of home invasion without yet committing murder. Around that same time, Chase accosted a female neighbor, restraining her until she handed over a cigarette pack, as if testing his own willingness to use force. Each incident was a prelude to the carnage to come. Chase was escalating, growing bolder and more violent as his fantasies demanded more than just the blood of animals. On January 23, 1978, Richard Chase struck in horrifying fashion. He targeted Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old 3 months pregnant homemaker in a quiet suburban neighborhood. That afternoon, Terry Wallen was taking out the garbage when Chase walked up to her doorstep and found the door unlocked. He pulled out a .22 caliber pistol, the same used on Griffin, and shot the young woman 3 times. 1 bullet hit her hand, a defensive wound, 1 her jaw, and a final shot to her temple that knocked her to the floor. Chase then followed her inside and proceeded to commit acts of almost unspeakable depravity. He stabbed the dying or deceased woman repeatedly with a butcher knife, slit her torso open from sternum to navel, and disemboweled her. He cut off her nipples and attempted to remove other organs, scattering blood everywhere. In a grotesque ritual, he collected Wallen's blood in a bucket and drank it, smeared blood on the walls, and even stuffed animal feces from her yard into her mouth. Chase sexually assaulted the corpse, penetrating her post-mortem, an act of necrophilia that he found arousing in a way regular intercourse never was for him. By the time he left the Wallen home, the scene was a mutilated bloodbath. The victim's husband, David Wallen, returned home from work to find his young wife's body in this horrific state, torso gaping open, organs missing, blood splashed across the walls. He was so traumatized that his mind couldn't immediately process the sight. Quote, "I had no idea where I was, or who or what I had seen," David later said. "It was just beyond all comprehension." The Wallen murder shocked Sacramento police, who now realized the earlier Griffin shooting was no random one-off. A serial killer was emerging, one who committed homicidal acts so depraved that even seasoned detectives were shaken. Investigators noted the chilling, vampiric elements of the crime. The killer had drunk the victim's blood and taken body parts as trophies, something virtually unheard of. The press seized on these details, and soon the mysterious killer was being called the Vampire or Dracula Killer in headlines. Fear gripped the community. Previously carefree suburbs now bristled with double-locked doors and firearms kept within reach. As one reporter observed, this was an era when doors were left unlocked, and Richard Chase represented the most terrifying prospect, a predator who could strike any home at any time if invited by mere casual carelessness. Only 4 days later, on January 27th, 1978, Richard Chase's killing frenzy reached its horrifying climax. That morning, 38-year-old Evelyn Miroff was at her home on Marywood Drive, babysitting her 22-month-old nephew David. Also present were Evelyn's friends Dan Meredith, 51, who had stopped by for a visit, and Evelyn's own son, Jason, age 6. Around midday, Chase roamed the neighborhood, performing his usual door check routine. He found the Meredith house's front door unlocked and let himself in with pistol in hand. Inside, he encountered Dan Meredith in the hallway and shot him point blank in the head, killing him instantly. Chase then turned the gun on Evelyn Miroff, who was cornered in her bedroom, and shot her once in the head as well. With all the adults dead, he savagely attacked their bodies. Just as with Wallen, Chase mutilated Evelyn's corpse grotesquely. He dragged her onto the bed, stripped her, and performed post-mortem sexual acts on her body. Using a kitchen knife, he opened her abdomen and removed several organs, pulling out intestines and internal tissue. Investigators later noted that the blood had been drained from the corpse and collected. Chase had clearly drunk from the body as part of his ritual. He stabbed Evelyn repeatedly, including wounds to her anus and an attempt to cut out an eye. The brutality eclipsed even the Wallen scene. Tragically, Chase did not spare the children in the home. He shot 6-year-old Jason Miroff twice in the head, killing the little boy on his mother's bedroom floor. Jason's body, mercifully, was left untouched by mutilation. He was simply executed. But baby David Ferriera suffered a fate as ghastly as Evelyn's. Chase seized the toddler from his crib and cut open the boy's skull to partially remove the brain for consumption. He stabbed the infant in the head and body and drank the child's blood, just as he had with the adults. By sheer chance, a knock on the door interrupted this carnage. A neighborhood girl, a playmate arriving for a scheduled playdate with Jason, came to the front door and startled Chase. Not wanting to be caught, he fled out the back, but not before snatching the bloody corpse of baby David and taking it with him. Chase stole Dan Meredith's station wagon and sped away from the scene, leaving behind an absolute house of horrors. When the alarmed little girl alerted a neighbor, police rushed to the Miroff home and were nearly overwhelmed by what they found. Seasoned Sacramento detective Ray Biondi described it as a house of carnage, with blood literally everywhere. In the entryway lay Dan Meredith's body in a pool of blood, car keys still in hand. In one bedroom, officers discovered Jason's small body in his pajamas, killed by gunshots to the head. Lying on the floor amid spattered blood and the signs of a struggle. But it was the sight in the master bedroom that would haunt even veteran detectives. Evelyn Miroff's nude corpse sprawled on the bed, her abdomen torn open and organs strewn about, like a grotesque parody of an autopsy. There was evidence of both necrophilia and cannibalism. Blood pooled around the body and gaping wounds where organs had been removed. And then, the baby was missing. Little David's crib was empty, soaked with blood, but no sign of the child, sending officers into a frantic search for the infant, praying he might somehow still be alive. The reality, however, was even more macabre. 2 months later, on March 24th, 1978, a decomposing cardboard box containing the remains of baby David was found, discarded, in a vacant lot not far from Chase's home. The tiny body had been mutilated. A portion of the brain, some body parts, and blood were evidence in Chase's refrigerator, confirming that the killer had taken the infant's remains with him to consume at his leisure. At this point, the full scope of the monster was clear. In just 4 weeks, Richard Chase had massacred 6 people, men, women, and children, increasing the brutality with absolutely no discernible motive beyond bloodlust. He left behind nightmarish crime scenes without any attempt to cover his tracks. Police found perfect handprints and shoe prints in the victim's blood at the Wallen and Mirath homes. It was as if Chase wanted the world to see his work. The community was petrified. A psychopath was on the loose, so said the newspapers, and anyone could be the next target. The random nature of Chase's home invasions, determined only by an unlocked door, meant everyone was vulnerable. As Halloween 1978 approached, vampire costumes and spooky decor took on a new, painful meaning for Sacramento residents. The usual autumn fears of ghosts and goblins were replaced by the lingering trauma of a real-life vampire who had stalked their streets in plain clothes. In community meetings and over dinner tables, families whispered about satanic cults and deranged killers, wondering if such occult horrors were creeping into their very own neighborhoods. The season of costumes and masks now carried the shadow of Chase's crimes, blurring the line between make-believe vampires and the very real monster who had drunk human blood in their town. What could drive a man to such extreme acts of savagery? In Richard Chase's case, untreated mental illness and elaborate delusions combined to create a perfect storm of psychosis. From his earliest adulthood, Chase suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, a diagnosis made multiple times during his psychiatric commitments. He also exhibited traits of antisocial personality, a disregard for the rights and lives of others, and had a heavy substance abuse history, particularly hallucinogenic drugs. Modern forensic psychologists note that this triple morbidity of psychosis, drug abuse, and antisocial traits dramatically increases the risk of violent behavior. Chase was a textbook example of this deadly trifecta. However, his particular brand of madness was uniquely grotesque, rooted in blood-focused delusions and bizarre conspiracy theories. Chase truly believed his own blood was vanishing, that he was dying from the inside out. He told doctors and later law enforcement that he suffered from a mysterious illness that made his blood turn to powder and his heart begin to shrink. In his psychotic mind, the only way to sustain himself was to absorb blood from outside sources. He began with animals, convinced that by drinking rabbit and dog blood, he could stave off his imagined blood insufficiency. Eventually, that morbid logic extended to humans. Consuming their blood and organs, he thought, could prevent his own body from deteriorating. After his capture, Chase candidly explained that he killed to obtain blood because he had to. It was necessary to sustain his life. In his twisted view, these murders were not crimes at all, but acts of self-preservation. Quote, "Under California law, it is justifiable homicide when a person kills to save his own life. And in my case, I was killing to obtain blood to live. Thus, it was justifiable," Chase reasoned to FBI profilers. This warped rationale shows how completely Chase's delusions overtook reality. Layered on top of his blood obsession were Chase's paranoid fantasies of conspiracy and cosmic threats. He wove an elaborate internal mythology that explained why he felt his blood was disappearing. FBI agents Robert Ressler and Russ Vorpagel, who interviewed Chase at length, found that his delusions were, quote, "rooted in nonsensical theories about UFOs, the mafia, and the CIA. All classic content for a paranoid schizophrenic mind. Chase believed he was the victim of a grand plot." He believed evil forces were poisoning him and stealing his blood. In particular, he fixated on the idea of Nazi extraterrestrials. He spoke of Nazi UFOs that emitted poison or death rays, which caused his blood to decay. He was equally terrified of imaginary Nazis and aliens working in tandem to kill him. In one jailhouse conversation, he implored Agent Ressler to help stop the Nazi UFO conspiracy. Chase asked for a radar gun so that he could capture the Nazi spaceships he believed were hovering invisibly, holding them responsible for the murders he committed. He also rambled about how prison officials were in league with the Nazis. He even handed Ressler a wadded-up blob of macaroni and cheese from his pocket, claiming he hadn't eaten it because the Nazis had poisoned it. These delusions were typical of a paranoid psychotic personality, the FBI later noted. Grandiose, bizarre, and utterly disconnected from reality. Chase's psychosis had a clear impact on how he selected victims and committed crimes. One of the eeriest insights from his interviews was his explanation that, quote, "if the door was locked, that means you're not welcome." In his fractured logic, a locked door signified that he might be repelled or harmed by whatever malevolent forces he imagined. An unlocked door was a sign he could proceed safely. This is why every one of his victims' homes had an unlocked door, a quirk that baffled investigators until Chase provided the answer. It was as if some dark, vampire folklore played out in his mind, recalling the legend that a vampire cannot enter a home without an invitation. For Chase, an unlocked door was that invitation. It's chilling to think how close other households came to tragedy simply by the luck of a locked latch. It's also worth noting how Chase's sexual dysfunction and violence became entangled in his pathology. He was impotent in normal sexual relationships, which caused him great frustration in youth. Yet, at his crime scenes, investigators found evidence that Chase became sexually aroused by death itself. The autopsies of his female victims showed signs of post-mortem rape and sexual mutilation. In Evelyn Miroth's case, semen was found inside her corpse, including anal injury, indicating Chase was able to perform sexually with a dead victim. This suggests that the only outlet for his sexual impulses was through acts of extreme violence and necrophilia. In the twisted theater of his mind, blood, murder, and sexual release were fused. He literally could only achieve an erection amid gore and death, a fact that cements just how profoundly disturbed his psyche was. Chase's psychology was a perfect horror. He saw himself as a persecuted victim, even as he preyed on innocent people. And he reveled in acts that combined survival, domination, and perversion all at once. It's no wonder that professionals later described him as, quote, one of the most deeply mentally ill serial killers of all time. Chase's final murders occurred in late January of 1978, but the specter of the vampire of Sacramento loomed large later that year as Halloween approached. Normally, autumn in America brings playful frights, children dressed as vampires, ghosts, and devils, and households carving jack-o'-lanterns. But the Chase case had blurred the line between Halloween fantasy and reality. When October 1978 rolled in, Sacramento was barely beginning to recover from the horror. The newspaper had spent months detailing Chase's gory deeds in court coverage, and the nickname Vampire Killer was indelibly stamped in the public's imagination. Parents who might otherwise hang cardboard vampire decorations in windows now shuddered at the thought, knowing a real vampire had stalked their streets. The usual fun of spooky season was tainted by the lingering question, what if real monsters are out there among us? In the late 1970s, Americans were growing anxious about a perceived rise in satanic or ritualistic crime and the dangers of the severely mentally ill. Just a few years earlier, the nation had been shocked by Charles Manson's cult murders and the occult claims surrounding the Son of Sam shootings. Chase's crime poured fuel on that fire, coming at a time when the public was primed to see signs of the devil in violent crime. Here was a killer who drank blood and violated corpses, behavior straight out of a truly dark horror movie or demonic folklore, operating in a nice, normal suburb. It was easy for imaginations to run wild. Rumors swirled about Satanism and black magic in connection with the case, though, in truth, Chase's demons were all in his mind. Community meetings on crime and safety suddenly included talk of mental health reform and even the supernatural. In Sacramento, some residents started drawing connections between Halloween's iconography and the grim reality they just experienced. Was it harmless for children to dress up as vampires and monsters when a real vampire had butchered a family next door? Such was the level of public fear and confusion that Chase wrought. The timing of Chase's capture, late January, meant that by the time the Halloween season neared, the trial was underway, and all of the gruesome details were spilling into headlines daily. As prosecutors presented evidence of blood-soaked blenders and cannibalized remains, the media coverage ensured that Chase's atrocities stayed in the public consciousness for months. By October, just weeks before the trial verdict, the local press was still running stories on the case, keeping it very much alive in minds of residents. The infamous monikers, Vampire of Sacramento, Dracula Killer, were repeated over and over, a constant reminder that true evil had visited their community. One can imagine parents steering their kids away from vampire costumes that Halloween, or recoiling at plastic fangs and fake blood used as decor. The usual haunted house attractions suddenly felt trivial compared to the house of real horrors left behind by Chase. In a broader sense, the Chase case fed into a growing national anxiety about how society should handle violent insanity. The late 70s saw the beginning of what would become the satanic panic of the 1980s, a fear that cults and devil worshippers were committing hidden atrocities, while Chase was not actually involved with any cult. The nature of his crimes, drinking blood, necrophilia, dismemberment, dovetailed with people's worst nightmares of satanic behavior. Simultaneously, America was questioning its policies on the mentally ill, as deinstitutionalization in the 1970s had released many psychiatric patients into communities without adequate support. Stories like Chase's, a diagnosed madman slipping through the cracks and committing unspeakable crimes, made headlines and prompted public outcry. As Halloween arrived, editorial pages debated, is this horror the price of failing our mental health system? Neighbors handed out candy with one eye nervously looking over their shoulders, wondering if there could be another Richard Chase out there. The season of make-believe ghouls was clouded by the memory of a real ghoul who had lived among them, and it made that Halloween one of the most uneasy Sacramento had ever seen. From the moment the details of Chase's murders became public, the media seized on the sensational nature of his crimes, and a wave of public panic ensued. Local newspapers and TV news stations provided wall-to-wall coverage of the case, often emphasizing the most gruesome aspects to an already frightened audience. It was the press that immortalized Chase with his dramatic nicknames, the Vampire of Sacramento and the Dracula Killer. Almost immediately after the Wallen murder came to light with its vampiric overtones, headlines invoked those monikers. This branding of Chase as a literal vampire, a creature from horror lore, had a twofold effect. On one hand, it captured the imagination in a morbid way, ensuring the story spread far and wide. On the other hand, it arguably heightened public fear to a frenzy. Chase was no longer just a man. He was a monster, maybe even a supernatural one, in the eyes of an increasingly anxious public. Sacramento residents who followed the news began to view the once safe city through a lens of dread. The media reported how the killer broke into homes in broad daylight and committed acts of cannibalism and necrophilia, often in lurid detail, though, notably, some outlets like Oxygen decades later felt the need to withhold many details due to their graphic nature. People absorbed these reports with horror. Gun shops saw a rise in sales as citizens armed themselves, and hardware stores ran low on locks and deadbolts as nearly everyone began fortifying their home at night. One contemporary account noted that during the month of Chase's spree, quote, local news buzzed with reports of an unknown individual committing brutal murders, leaving detectives puzzled, which only fed the atmosphere of alarm and confusion. The fact that police seemed stumped, since the killer had no clear pattern, beyond extreme savagery. That made it all the more terrifying. In the media narrative, Richard Chase was overwhelmingly portrayed as an inhuman fiend. The vampire label did more than reference just his blood drinking. It painted him as something almost otherworldly, a figure of pure nightmare fuel. Journalists often compared crime scene details to horror movies or gothic novels, reinforcing the notion that this case was beyond the pale. At times, Chase was also called an apparent psychopath and deranged killer in reports, language that, while not inaccurate, further dehumanized him in the public eye. There was relatively little focus in initial reporting on his schizophrenia diagnosis or the failures of the system. Those discussions came later, during the trial and in retrospectives. Instead, early media coverage leaned into the sensational and the scary, effectively turning Chase into a local boogeyman. This framing had consequences. Many in the public viewed mentally ill individuals with increased suspicion, unable to separate Chase's sickness from his evil deeds, rather than see him purely as a patient who slipped through the cracks. The prevailing public sentiment, stoked by the press, was that he was simply evil incarnate. Any nuance about his psychiatric history was often lost under headlines like Vampire Killer's House of Blood. However, once Chase was captured and the story shifted to the courtroom, some media did begin to explore how someone so disturbed had been released from hospitals. Articles appeared questioning the role of Chase's family and doctors, and whether more should have been done when he began to exhibit clear red flags, such as his blood-soaked incident in Nevada or his institutional nickname Dracula, which in hindsight seemed ominously apt. Still, these analyses were often drowned out by the more visceral, gripping trial coverage. Importantly, the timing of Chase's crimes in 1977 and 78 put him among a notorious roster of California serial killers dominating headlines. Just a year prior, in 1977, the Son of Sam case in New York, though reported across the country, had Americans on edge about random killers. 1978 also saw the arrest of the Hillside Stranglers in Los Angeles, and not long after, in the 1980s, the area would be struck by the Night Stalker. The media lumped Chase into this pantheon of monsters, sometimes comparing their body counts or brutality. One content analysis noted that Chase was depicted as much more heinous and ravenous than many other killers, thanks in part to the vampire nickname and the ghastly particulars of his deeds. In truth, Chase's victim count, 6, was lower than that of several serial killers like Ted Bundy or John Gacy. But the sheer brutality of each murder, the evisceration, the blood drinking, made him far more terrifying in the public mind. The press played this up relentlessly, and Sacramentans responded accordingly, with panic. Oral histories from Sacramento residents recall that people stopped going out at night if they didn't have to, and neighborhood watch groups sprang up in the immediate aftermath. For weeks, rumors circulated. Every transient or oddball in the city suddenly drew suspicion as a possible second vampire. In short, the media's depiction of Chase as a virtually inhuman creature helped create a climate of fear where nobody felt safe. Richard Chase was finally brought to justice through a combination of astute profiling, a lucky encounter, and solid police work. In the wake of the mass murder at the Meredith home, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was called in due to the unprecedented savagery of the crimes. Veteran profilers Robert Ressler, credited with popularizing the term serial killer, and Ross Vorpagel analyzed the crime scenes and put together a remarkably accurate offender profile. They predicted the killer would be a young white male in his mid-20s, thin and malnourished, likely a loner with a history of mental illness and drug use, living alone in disorganized squalor within a mile of the crime scene. They even suggested he might not have a driver's license or car, given the disarray of his life, and that he may attempt to continue killing, given his lack of planning and impulse for blood. This profile was dead on. It was essentially a portrait of Chase himself. Meanwhile, witnesses and tips were starting to surface. Several people had seen a tall, skinny, disheveled man in an orange parka lurking around the victim's neighborhood around the time of the murders. Police released a sketch based on these sightings. One person who saw it was Nancy Holden, a young woman who had gone to high school with Richard Chase. Astonishingly, Nancy had run into Chase at a shopping center just days before the Meredith murders. At the time, she found the encounter deeply unsettling. Chase, whom she barely recognized, had approached her in his grubby orange jacket and asked bizarre questions, like whether she had been on a motorcycle when her former boyfriend was killed in an accident. Nancy left the interaction feeling that something was very wrong with him. When she later heard about the police search for a suspect in a parka, she immediately suspected Rick Chase. In a courageous move, she contacted authorities and told them about her strange meeting with Chase, emphasizing that he matched the description and had a history of disturbed behavior. This tip was the break investigators needed. A background check on Richard Trenton Chase revealed that he owned a .22 caliber handgun and had a record of psychiatric problems. He also lived roughly 1 mile from the major crime scenes, exactly as the FBI profile predicted. On January 27, 1978, the very same day as the Meredith murders, police raced to Chase's address, an apartment not far from the carnage he'd just left. When they knocked on his door, Chase refused to open it. He was inside, likely in the process of hiding or destroying evidence. The officers, aware that he was likely armed and extremely dangerous, devised a quick ruse. They hid out of sight down the hallway and pretended to leave, calling out, "Okay, let's go," as if giving up. Sure enough, the paranoid Chase took the bait, believing the police were gone. He emerged from his apartment carrying a box, later found to contain bloody rags and remains. He still wore his stained orange parka, and notably, he had Dan Meredith's wallet in his back pocket. In a flash, officers converged and tackled Richard Chase to the ground. The struggle was brief. The thin, sickly 27-year-old was no match for multiple police officers, and he was taken into custody right there in the dingy apartment hallway. Officers noted that Chase himself was literally covered in blood, not from any injury, but from the gruesome trophies he had been handling. What detectives found inside Chase's apartment immediately confirmed that they had their man, and also revealed the full extent of his ghastly activities. Every surface seemed to be coated in blood. The walls, the floor, the kitchen appliances, the place reeked of decay. Investigators discovered a blood-soaked blender on the counter, the same blender he had used to puree animal entrails, now being used for human organs, as well as several pet collars with no pets in sight. Opening the refrigerator, police were confronted with a scene straight out of a horror film. Body parts wrapped in plastic and foil, including pieces later identified as belonging to Evelyn Meredith and Teresa Wallen. In the freezer, they found human brains and organs, notably a piece of brain matter in a Tupperware that proved to be baby David's. A bucket in the kitchen contained more visceral remains mixed with blood. The bloody box Chase had been carrying held soiled newspapers and rags used to transport pieces of the infant. It was an appalling cache of evidence, but it meant the case against Chase was ironclad. Chase was swiftly charged with 6 counts of murder, and the case moved to trial in 1979. Given the overwhelming physical evidence and Chase's own statements, there was never any doubt that he had committed the killings. His own attorneys conceded as much. The primary question was his sanity and degree of culpability. The defense's strategy was to avoid the death penalty by portraying Chase as a severely mentally ill man who was not fully in control of his actions. They argued for a verdict of second-degree murder or manslaughter due to diminished capacity, which would have meant a life sentence in a psychiatric facility rather than execution. Indeed, Chase's history of schizophrenia and the utter irrationality of his crimes provided a strong basis for an insanity plea. 2 court-appointed psychiatrists examined him and, somewhat surprisingly, declared that Chase was competent to stand trial. He understood the charges and could assist in his defense despite his delusions. This meant the trial would proceed in a typical fashion, with the jury tasked to decide if he was legally sane at the time of his crimes. The trial of Richard Chase in early 1979 was highly publicized and intensely followed by the local community. In the courtroom, the thin, sallow defendant cut a markedly unimposing figure, a far cry from the mythical vampire of headlines. He often sat quietly, occasionally twitching or whispering to himself, but largely appearing detached. Prosecutors presented the grisly evidence in full: graphic photos of the crime scenes, the blender and tools from his apartment, and medical testimony about the mutilations. The jurors and the crowded gallery listened in horror as forensic experts described how Chase had opened skulls and abdomens to extract blood and organs. Family members of victims gave tearful testimonies. Most heartbreaking was David Wallen's account of finding his pregnant wife's body and the grief of the Miroth family, who lost 3 generations in one afternoon. Some of them, overcome by emotion, had to leave the courtroom during the graphic testimony. The defense experts, on the other hand, detailed Chase's long history of psychiatric disturbance. They recounted his delusions of stolen arteries, his Dracula antics in the hospital, and the fact that he was diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic years before the murders. One psychiatrist testified that Chase lived in a separate reality. He truly did not comprehend the wrongness of his actions because he was driven by imaginary forces and desperate fear for his own life. However, under cross-examination, these experts had to admit that Chase knew killing was against the law. He simply believed he had no choice. The prosecution hammered this point. Legal insanity in California requires not understanding the nature of one's act or being unable to distinguish right from wrong. They argued that Chase, for all his illness, still went to lengths to hide some of his actions. For example, disposing of the baby's body where he thought it might not be found quickly, and fleeing when interrupted. This suggested he did know his acts were wrong. The prosecutor described Chase not just as insane, but as evil, a man who made a conscious choice to act on his blood cravings. After a trial that lasted 5 months and featured some 70 witnesses, the case went to the jury, and it did not take them long. On May 8, 1979, the jury returned a verdict, finding Richard Trenton Chase guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. In doing so, they rejected the insanity defense, implicitly concluding that, however disturbed, Chase knew what he was doing. Jurors later said that the meticulous cruelty of his crimes and the planning, such as loading his gun, bringing knives, choosing victims at random, convinced them that Chase was legally sane during his rampage. The same jury then had to decide his punishment. Considering the heinous circumstances, multiple victims, including a child, extreme depravity, it was perhaps no surprise that they opted for the death penalty. It took them only an hour of deliberation to affirm Chase's sanity, and a few more hours to unanimously sentence him to death in the gas chamber. When the verdict was read, Chase reportedly showed little reaction. Some witnesses say he nodded to himself slightly. Others recall him staring off into space. The public, however, reacted with relief and approval. After months of living with this vampiric tale, seeing the monster condemned to death was cathartic for Sacramento. Outside the courthouse, crowds actually cheered the verdict. The Sacramento Bee ran the headline, "Vampire Guilty to Die in Gas Chamber," capturing the community's sense that a menace was being purged. It's worth noting that Chase's mother, who had been in denial about her son's illness for years, did attend parts of the trial. In a bizarre and tragic moment, she reportedly approached Teresa Wallen's grieving husband during a recess and criticized the Wallen's dog for not protecting Teresa on the day of the murder. The comment stunned those around her. It seemed even in that moment, Chase's mother could not fully grasp the human responsibility her son bore, instead blaming a pet for not stopping a killer. Such a disconnect underscored the deep dysfunction surrounding Chase's life. The trial ended with Chase formally sentenced to San Quentin State Prison's death row, and the judge remarked that the case was one of the most disturbing he had ever seen. Richard Chase spent the remainder of his short life on death row at San Quentin, but his story did not end quietly. In prison, the man once feared as a vampire became an object of revulsion, even among hardened criminals. Other inmates, aware of the graphic and perverse nature of Chase's crimes, feared him and reportedly kept their distance. Prison officials noted that even gang members wanted nothing to do with Chase. In fact, a kind of dark prison lore grew around him. Inmates taunted Chase and encouraged him to kill himself. They would shout things like, "Drink your own blood," or "Do the world a favor," through the cell bars. To them, he was beyond any code. Someone who killed babies and defiled corpses was the lowest of the low. Chase's mental state, unsurprisingly, did not improve in incarceration. If anything, removed from any treatment and isolated in a cell, his delusions continued to fester. 2 FBI agents, Ressler and another profiler, visited Chase on death row as part of their research into serial killers. These interviews with Chase became an important case study in the minds of criminal profilers. Chase spoke freely about his theories. He reiterated that he had to kill to stave off the Nazis and aliens plotting against him. He rambled about needing a radar gun to track the UFOs that the Nazis had, which were beaming signals into his head. Ressler recounted in his book, Whoever Fights Monsters, the incident we described earlier involving a pile of macaroni and cheese in Chase's pocket, which he had been hoarding in order to have it tested because he believed prison officials were poisoning his meals on the Nazis' orders. It was an unprecedented glimpse into the mind of a disorganized, paranoid serial killer, and these conversations have since been used to train law enforcement on criminal psychology. In the later years, the FBI would cite the Chase case when teaching how a disorganized killer, one driven by internal psychosis rather than careful planning, behaves. Unlike methodical killers, Chase left chaotic crime scenes, struck at random, and had no clear objective besides satisfying delusional impulses, making him a classic study in this category. Chase's legal appeals went nowhere. He had little basis to appeal, given he was clearly guilty and had been found sane by both jury and prior psychiatric evaluation. In the end, Richard Trenton Chase took matters into his own hands. On December 26, 1980, the day after Christmas, a guard doing morning rounds found Chase lying awkwardly in his cell, not breathing. The 30-year-old had died by suicide, a final act of control by the killer who loved control. He had been stockpiling his prescribed antidepressant pills for weeks, hiding them instead of taking them. That night, he ingested a lethal dose of these hoarded pills. By the time the guards reached him, Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, was dead. In a grim irony, the man who had so feared being poisoned had ultimately poisoned himself. Prison officials and psychiatrists were not surprised. In fact, one had noted that other death row inmates had goaded Chase to do it, and likely he succumbed to his inner demons and the hopelessness of his situation. After his death, the legacy of Richard Chase lived on in many disturbing ways. True crime authors and filmmakers quickly recognized the morbidly fascinating aspects of the case. In 1987, director William Friedkin released the film Rampage, loosely based on Chase's story. The film explored the insanity defense and the moral questions of executing a mentally ill murderer, clearly drawing from the debates sparked by Chase's trial. Notably, Rampage even features a prosecutor character who changes stance on the death penalty after witnessing the fictionalized killer's atrocities, a scenario reminiscent of the real jurors who had no qualms sentencing Chase to death. Chase's crimes have been referenced in songs, novels, and numerous documentaries. He appeared as a case study in episodes of shows like Most Evil and was discussed in several true crime books. In legendary FBI profiler Robert Ressler's memoir, Whoever Fights Monsters, an entire chapter is devoted to Chase, including verbatim excerpts from their chilling prison talks. Ressler considered Chase an exemplar of the disorganized lust killer, someone driven by delusion and sexual violence, as opposed to calculated motive. For the field of forensic psychology, Chase's case became a cautionary tale about the importance of treating severe mental illness. It highlighted how a perfect storm of schizophrenia, substance abuse, and social isolation can explode into violence if not adequately monitored. In academic literature, some have cited Chase when discussing the future of deinstitutionalization, noting that in the 1970s, many psychiatric patients were released without proper follow-up, sometimes with dire results. Indeed, the Chase case raised public awareness about the thin line between a mentally ill person who is merely odd and one who is truly dangerous. It forced difficult conversations. Could this have been prevented? The hospital staff who treated Chase certainly believed so. They had tried to warn that he was dangerous. After the trial, lawmakers in California even referenced the case in calls to tighten gun laws. Case had lied on his firearms application about his mental health, and to allow longer commitments for individuals deemed a threat to themselves or others. In popular culture, the mythos of the vampire of Sacramento endures as one of the most disturbing true crime stories on record. He is often brought up around Halloween for obvious reasons, his story more macabre than any fiction. Podcasts like these and YouTube channels recount his crimes to audiences both horrified and grimly intrigued, often emphasizing the lesson that monsters can be real. Generations of Sacramento residents have passed down the folklore. Always lock your doors, or else the vampire might come in. That warning originated directly from Chase's case. As one Sacramento reporter quipped, Richard Chase is the reason people started locking their doors at night. And so, when the Halloween decorations go up each year and plastic vampires leer with fanged grins, the tale of Richard Trenton Chase remains a uniquely cautionary tale. It reminds us that sometimes the truly scary monsters are not those from ancient legends, but ordinary men walking our neighborhood streets. The vampire of Sacramento was flesh and blood, and that is perhaps the most chilling fact of all. His brief, bloody rampage has long since ended, but the echoes of his madness and murder continues to haunt those who dare to look into the abyss of the human psyche, especially on dark autumn nights when the veil between nightmares and reality feels perilously thin. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com, and produced by Dan Wilder, with original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.